Dad had lived to his mid-70s and he hadn't been all that fit for probably a couple of years. You can see him there in a wheelchair at Carrow Road. He was a massive Norwich fan. He'd retired back to Norfolk with my mum living on the Norfolk coast in Cromer. And when the story emerged earlier this week of yet another party, you're going to recognise, Jeremy, the woman on the right, your mum.
I was sorry to break it, but yeah, I was with my mum last night. She said, "Oh, I talk to Jill on the phone all the time," so that's rather nice. Yeah.
Lovely. And yeah, when the news broke the other night, like lots and lots of people, we were thinking, right, what was I doing May the 20th, 2020? And I didn't really need to check photos or anything to remember that. It'd been my wife Doreena's birthday the day before. And I remember mum calling me because dad was in hospital. He'd been in a few times over the course of 2 to 3 years, but her tone was very different. She'd spoken to the consultant at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital in Norwich, and the consultant has said very sadly dad had multi-organ failure and had only days left to live. And then we're in this horrible position where mum's saying, we can't go into the hospital, we're not allowed in at the moment. I don't think there's any point you coming back to Norfolk. We were living down in Reading at the time, because we can't go in and we just don't know what to do. We need to be near just in case we get that call to say you can go in. So I had a camper van. We jumped in the camper van, drove to my sister who lives just outside Norwich. And she sent a message out on the WhatsApp group in her neighborhood just saying, look, this is what's happening with my dad. Is it okay if my brother stays in the camper van on the drive? So if we get the call from the hospital where we can go in and say goodbye, he's there and able to do so along with us. So just such a strange time, really, really tough time. And I'm so aware from the hundreds of messages actually I've had over the last few days since I put a tweet up on the night, just expressing my anger, just of so many people in far, far worse situations than we were. But we, Jeremy, like so many, were abiding by the rules. We slept on my sister's drive. We waited patiently, but fear-filled, full of anxiety for 5 days, waiting to hear if we would be able to go in and say goodbye to our dad. And I'm very aware, as I say this morning to you, that there'll be people watching and people listening back who never, ever got that opportunity. So we count ourselves blessed that we eventually did. But my goodness me, those first 5 days were incredibly tough.
And now you look and you see that almost at the same point on the calendar, there's a party going on.
Yeah, and as we found out last night, yet more parties. We're finding out, yes, the Prime Minister wasn't at the ones that were revealed last night, but they came on the eve of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. And you were so right what you said earlier about that picture of the Queen at his funeral, sat on her own. It is one of the most powerful images I've seen as well, because in many ways, she was emblematic in that moment of what so many of us had to go through. Our funeral for our dad was tiny. And it was the same for countless others who sat on their own. We think back to those horrific images, that video of that poor woman mourning on her own, her 2 sons wanting to comfort her, moving their chairs alongside her, only for someone to step in and say, that's not the rules, and move them back again. People made sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. And I've said this so many times when it comes to grief, Jeremy, and you'll know this from losing your dear dad, who my mum and dad knew so well, an amazing guy. It's incredibly painful. If you don't get that goodbye, closure is incredibly difficult, and the grieving process so much harder than it already is. When you have that chance to say goodbye, you get that closure, then the tough grieving process begins, and then you begin slowly to rebuild your lives. For the countless many out there who never got that chance, this is awful. And so when they're reading stories and seeing the news full of stories of parties, of a prime minister essentially saying he thought it was a work do, it hurts. And it drives the anger inside us, because we think we made sacrifices because our government was saying this is what we need to do. And we recognized back in May 2020, that was what we needed to do. And yet our government were doing something completely different. And that is why there is such a groundswell of anger out there. And I include myself amongst them.
And you think, do you, that Boris Johnson's time is up?
I absolutely do believe his time is up, but sadly, I don't think it probably will be. I mean, I was incensed and yet not surprised yesterday to hear Jacob Rees-Mogg, who often gets put onto the front line when the Prime Minister doesn't want to speak, somehow in the House of Commons yesterday suggesting that perhaps the rules back in May 2020 were a little bit too harsh. Well, okay, you may think, Jacob, it might get your government off the hook and your prime minister off the hook. It doesn't get any of the countless others off the hook who are struggling with the fact that they never got to say goodbye. I had a message from a woman last night who waved goodbye to her dad through the window of the nursing home. Are you really saying to us, Jacob, and the rest of the government that the rules were too harsh? Because that's not going to give that woman and many, many others the chance to go back and say a proper goodbye. It's offensive. It's wrong. It's unjust. There is not a shred of integrity left on that front bench. And to see Mogg coming out yesterday and saying what he said was yet more offence being wafted the way of the many, many people in this country who made sacrifices and now dealing with grief without goodbyes. He has to go. Sadly, though, for the time being, I don't think he will.
Thank you, Simon, for talking to us. I really appreciate your time. Love to your family. And thanks for remembering your
Thanks, Jeremy.
lovely dad, Andrew, with us as well. Thank you.